welcome. Today we have an interview with Dr. Bill Donohue, who's head of the Catholic League, and he's really written what I consider to be a phenomenal new book. I just read it electronically on Kindle, so I just have this electronic version here. It's The Truth About Clergy Sexual Abuse, Clarifying the Facts and the Causes. And before Bill starts talking, I want to say I've never read anything like it. And if you had told me it was written by a Lutheran critic of the church during the Protestant Reformation, with descriptions of orgies and violation of vows and sexual improprieties, I would have not been surprised. But what's most amazing is how Bill points out the Catholic Church dealt with the problem and has basically solved the problem for the church. And there are just a handful of cases today, and they instituted very strict procedures. And I can vouch for that because I have a friend who's a Catholic convert, and he became a lay server, and he didn't like it. He had to get some kind of background check on his sex life before he was allowed to give out wafers in the church for communion. So this is not an exaggeration. It's probably got the strictest procedures of any organization in the world right now to keep it from happening. And the second point, because I know Bill, once he gets talking, I'm not going to get a word in, the problem was widespread, not just in the Catholic Church, but the media made you think it was the Catholic Church. Well, I know of 3 major cases which have not received similar publicity. In Boston, the Fessenden School, because I know somebody who went there, which was an elite private school for WASP Yankees, had Harvard grads teaching there, had a major crisis of child molestation. DC, the Beauvoir School, which is a top Episcopalian school, connected with the National Cathedral, which had to let an elementary school teacher go. And New York City, where I went to school, in Riverdale, where I went, and I had applied to Horace Mann, but I ended up at Riverdale Country School. Horace Mann had a notorious scandal of child abuse, none of which received any fraction of this type of publicity. And these were all elite establishment institutions. And then finally, a separate issue in Washington, D.C., a synagogue, which I have gone to, which was Senator Lieberman's synagogue. Kesher Israel, the rabbi, well, this is a heterosexual scandal, specialized in converting wives to Judaism. And in Judaism, you have to go into a mikveh. And he actually put a hidden camera there to film the women as they went into the bath. And he was then caught, and he lost his job. But that certainly was not a good thing. And the point is that these problems happen everywhere, exactly as Dr. Donohue says in his book. So we're going to talk about why the Catholic Church has been singled out. The 3 issues we're going to talk about today are the role of homosexuality, how the Catholic Church confronted the crisis, and I am persuaded solved it as much as humanly possible. And then third, my own issue, the larger political context that this occurs in, and why it's still an issue today. And other institutions, including the public schools, I didn't mention Washington, D.C., we had a school principal who was killed when he had hired 2 child prostitutes to come to his house, and they turned out to be rougher than just rough trade, and they murdered him. And this was one of the new hires in this sort of reform of the public schools in DC to make them more contemporary. That got very little publicity as well. In fact, it was mostly, this is when I was living in DC, in the gay press. Finally, the Washington Post was forced to run one story, which really didn't tell you very much. So we can talk about the public schools as well. So with that said, my introduction, Bill Donohue, congratulations on a book that does pull no punches, just as you said. I'm amazed the church let you publish it. It's so embarrassing. I mean, you talk about the Lavender Mafia in the church. You talk about priests having orgies, priests who are drug dealers and giving drugs to kids. I mean, everything that the worst paranoid might think about the Catholic Church, which happens everywhere, but it also has happened in the Catholic Church, is documented in your book. And then you talk about how the church dealt with it. So let's begin with that. How did you come to write this book? And how did you have the nerve to put this in? And did you have anyone in the church say, wait a minute, you can't say that.
As a matter of fact, I'm proud to say that Ignatius Press is the largest Catholic publishing house in the United States. It's the one where all the popes publish by there. So the fact that Ignatius picked it up, which is a tribute to Father Fessio, and he assigned 3 editors, not one, but his top editor plus 2 others, to make certain that we went over something like 843 footnotes that I have. This is not an essay. This is all data collected by me over 20 years. I put the book together a lot shorter than that time, but I finally decided so much of the conventional wisdom out there is wrong on almost every level. And there's been no book by a social scientist on this subject. And most of it's been on the left, of course, which is the left has driven, which we'll get into, much of the problem in the first place. So I'm very proud. I've got a copy of the book right here too. I'm just gonna hold it up. The truth about clergy sexual abuse. And I think that if people really want to get a fair understanding, because I don't pull any punches, as you said, Larry, I'm not, this is not sugarcoating anybody. I am saying I'm very proud of the tremendous progress that the Catholic Church has made, which the media do not want to report.
Well, especially when you have cases in the media now. I mean, you've got the Epstein trial and the, well, he died, but the Maxwell trial in New York right now, major media figures are involved, major politicians are involved, major billionaires are involved, the royal family is involved, you know, and if you compare the publicity to what happened in the Catholic Church to what's going on right now involving sex with children, you'll find you could do an interesting analysis of the minutes and inches and editorials. There seems to be a disparate treatment here. Why?
But not only that, but let's keep in mind, there are people in Hollywood to this day who defend with vigor Michael Jackson, Roman Polanski, and the worst in the world are clearly the French. I've never seen a country where the intellectuals are more corrupt than in France, where when you've seen people like Sartre and de Beauvoir and Foucault and others, to this day, these people, the great intellectuals there, they defended people like Matzoff and others. They defend males having sex with children. They want to lower the age of consent. So all of a sudden now, these same people are horrified to learn that when men are having sex with boys, that's wrong. They've been encouraging it, not only in France, but we even have groups in the United States called B4. It's the capital B, and then the numeric 4, B4U, the letter U, hyphen ACT. B4U hyphen ACT is an organization of psychologists and psychiatrists from the United States, from Harvard, from Yale, from the London School of Economics. And they are arguing that we need to stop at the stigma of pedophiles. We need to understand that male and adult males and younger men, that's okay, that we have to just come to a new reckoning on this whole situation. So to see that the intellectuals in this country and abroad, mostly in the Western world, they are the people who are pushing for this kind of sexual liberation. At the same time, they're saying, well, there was a problem. Yeah, there was back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, mostly, when the Catholic Church succumbed to the sexual revolution instead of resisting the sexual revolution. They caught the same winds that the intellectuals were promoting, and it almost destroyed the church. So the hypocrisy is everywhere.
I think it's more than hypocrisy. I think it's a program, because the church officially wasn't going along with the left agenda. And this was to say, in other words, they may actually approve of child molesting, but they're going to use it against the church because the church was officially against it. And they were going to say, if you just shut up about this, we'll take care of you. Let me ask you a question. I was most shocked, as you said, the left within the church. I had no idea, not being Catholic myself, that the church, which I thought of as this very authoritarian, hierarchical, rigid, military-like institution, the Pope seemed to have very little authority about what was going on, either in the parishes or in the seminaries or in the monasteries or in the convents or anywhere else. You know, we have this Sound of Music like idea, but in fact, it seemed, you talk about the sexual revolution in the 1960s and 70s, it seemed to be going on in the Catholic Church itself. How could that happen?
Well, for one thing, as I've said many times to the media, the Catholic Church is not like the Amish. God bless the Amish. They're isolated from societies. They voluntarily want to be that way. The Catholic Church is very much a part of the culture. And so when there's a cultural wind in the dominant culture that is affecting our society, such as the sexual revolution back in the 60s, and one could argue continuing for decades later, the Catholic Church was not unaffected by it. The 70s was the most disgraceful decade in the history of the Catholic Church in the United States. I am absolutely convinced. Instead of resisting the sexual revolution, they just simply succumbed. When you have books by Anthony Kosnick, a priest, called Human Sexuality, and another book of the same title, Human Sexuality, by Crooks and Bauer, being taught in the seminaries in the 1970s, saying to these young men studying to be a priest that we should not be judgmental about any form of sexual experience or any act, whether it's sex with the dead, necrophilia, homosexuality, bestiality, sex with dogs. We just have to be less judgmental and don't stigmatize people. My point in the book is, if you're a healthy guy and you hear this nonsense being taught by some sick priest in the 1970s, I'm not saying in all the seminaries, but certainly too many of them, you're not going to go out there and start preying on kids or with having sex with other men, because you know better. However, what if you already are disordered? What if already you have some psychological issues? You have some real serious problems. And now you hear from a priest saying we should not be judgmental. He signs you a book which verifies it. Does that not give the green light to these people to act on their worst impulses instead of restraining them? And in fact, it does. It was a disgraceful chapter in the Catholic Church. You know, it's interesting, Larry, when this came about, when we knew about it in the big way, 2002, with the Boston Globe, most of the crisis was behind us. The bill came due in 2002 from what the church did in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where most of this stuff took place. And so people were left with the impression, wow, this is happening now. No, it really happened decades earlier for the most part. And today, you're hearing about old cases. Almost every bad priest who was involved in this is either dead or he's out of ministry. So that's the good news.
But how did they come in the first place? Was there just a shortage of priests? I mean, was there no way to sort of separate the problems from the non-problems?
Well, that's an excellent question. Let me give you a two-part response to that. Number one, almost all the problems by homosexuals, 80% of it is homosexual driven. Now, did they have homosexuals in the Catholic Church back in the 40s and 50s when we didn't have this problem? Of course they did. How many? I don't know, but they certainly had certainly more than the general population. Okay, they didn't act out. Why not? The culture in America and in the church was one of restraint, particularly in the church. And so you may have been a homosexual, but you weren't going to act on your impulses because you knew better. Now, what happened to those same guys in the 60s and 70s when the lid came off and you could exercise your libido, or what Freud called your id, the pleasure principle, without consequence, with impunity? Many of them started acting out. Then there was a surge into the seminaries in the 70s and 80s of homosexuals because the word got out. Hey, fellas, there's a party going on. Why not join it? There's not going to be any punishment whatsoever because so many of these seminarian officials were delinquent, including many of the bishops.
And so you're saying, really, as a sociologist, the church itself was not the timeless institution we think of as a fortress against change, but it was blowing with the wind, as Bob Dylan would say.
That's exactly what I'm saying. And no pope has spoken more authoritatively on this than Benedict. John Paul II, bless him, but he wasn't in the best mental state in his last years when some of this stuff was really coming to the fore. And I don't want to give him a pass altogether. He didn't do a great job on this. Francis has continued what Benedict started. And what I'm saying, what Benedict said on the day before he was named as Pope, he said, we got to get rid of the filth in the Catholic Church. And everybody knew what he was talking about. We knew what the filth was, these abusers. And so what did he do about it? He got rid of so many of these predatory priest, but more importantly, he instituted norms. And he made it clear, which is the norm today in the Catholic Church under Pope Francis, if you are a man who has, quote, deep-seated homosexual tendencies, the priesthood is not for you. Do not come and join. We don't want you. Now, a lot of gay priests are upset about that. I love it. It should have been said many years before.
Pope Francis is continuing this?
Yes, exactly. And that's why we don't see a surge. In matter of fact, if anything, we used to have thousands of accusations, not all of which were true, back in the 1970s against priests and the clergy in general, the deacons and the priests. Today, we're down to single digits in terms of the number of substantiated accusations made against 50,000 members of the clergy. In other words, this problem has almost been totally wiped out. The Catholic Church has made unbelievable progress for lots of different reasons. But I would have to, if I had to give one person in the Catholic Church the most credit, it clearly would be Pope Benedict XVI.
Okay, well, thank you. Let me ask you one question on that. Are there any comparative studies of institutions and how they've dealt with this problem in terms of, you mentioned in your book, the public schools, and you mentioned other religions, and you mentioned the military. I mean, I was shocked living in Washington to find out there's quite a problem in the military of predatory behavior. You know, even the Republican Party, you had Larry Craig, who was found in a men's room and said he wasn't gay when he was a senator. How does the Catholic Church stack up compared side by side with other institutions? Has anyone done that study?
Well, yes. I mean, yes and no. I mean, it's kind of hard to do the studies. It's been a double-edged sword for the Catholic Church that it collects data on its own priest about everything. If an old lady sees a priest who apparently had too much to drink in a restaurant and she contacts the local diocese, they might question him. And then, you know what, though? They throw her complaint into his file. Now, the Catholic, this has come back to haunt us because they don't do that in the public schools. They don't do that amongst Muslims and Jews and Protestants and others. We're hierarchical to that extent, even though the authority is much more latitudinal than people expect, which you alluded to before. One bishop has no control over another bishop. So, but they do keep a lot of records. Now, if you're a rapacious lawyer and you want to go after the Catholic Church, it's a field day. When it comes time for depositions, you can just subpoena almost anything. Try that with the Methodists. They don't keep the kinds of records that the Catholic Church does. They get away with it a lot easier.
That's interesting. So you're saying actually because the Catholic Church is more meticulous, it's
yes.
a better target.
Back to haunt them. Yeah.
But is there a way to turn that around? All right. So I think you've done the major issue and how the Catholic Church has confronted the crisis. I was very interested. I didn't realize Pope Francis, you know, he's such a darling of the left. You wouldn't know that he's continuing this. This can't be too popular with left organizations, this initiative.
Let me answer that question. I'm glad you brought it up. We at the Catholic League have been tracking this since Francis came in, and it was 2013. Let me tell you something. Yes, he's left on social justice issues, immigration reform, left-wing causes like climate control and stuff like that, about which he knows no more about than I do. I wish more people would just simply admit that. He actually came out and said he was against air conditioning. I guess they have no air conditioning in the Vatican. That would be a shocker to Bill Donohue. But I can tell you this, that on those kind of social economic issues, he's definitely on the left. There's no question about that. And he's shown a certain kind of animus even against some Orthodox Catholics who like the Latin Mass. However, to give him his due, when it comes to issues like abortion, which he calls murder, when it comes to issues such as a man thinking he can become a woman and vice versa, he says gender ideology is, quote, demonic. You won't hear that out of Benedict or John Paul II. When it comes to a lot of things on moral issues, he is magnificent. It's underreported intentionally by the mainstream media, and I want to single out the Catholic media, which is generally on the left, just like the regular media. There's no difference there for the most part. There's always exceptions. The big exception would be EWTN, but many of the Catholic publications are on the left, and they don't want the people to know, especially Catholics, that he has a conservative side to him, particularly on homosexuality and abortion and things of that nature, and the transgender thing. They want to keep that. They want to keep that quiet. We think we should just tell the truth about Pope Francis and every pope and any priest about everything, and not just play games. They're shading the truth intentionally.
That's amazing. I honestly didn't realize it until you just said it now. That makes me think a little differently about what's going on. So let's talk a little bit now about the big picture. Your book goes into great detail how the church responded and legal strategies and paying settlements and not fighting and moving people back and forth and all sorts of stuff that's the church was looking at as a crisis that was about the church. But what about the issue that the church was just a pawn in the game, that there may have been a larger struggle going on, let's say a struggle against Western civilization in general. The idea is to bring down the West. And because the church is one of the biggest institutions and had certainly under John Paul II and Benedict, an anti-communist reputation, the idea was to hobble, hurt, distract, cause monetary pain, etc. And this was a good issue. Like I used to work for David Horowitz. He always says the issue is never the issue. It was just to stick it to the church. And I was reminded, I talked to you before we went on the record, when I went into all of this cultural stuff, I was doing the PBS issue, and there was a film called Stop the Church. And that advocated people going into church services and disrupting them because they were blaming the Catholic Church for the AIDS epidemic, even though the church was against homosexual sex and drug use officially. So, although I guess if there were a lot of orgies going on I didn't know about, maybe they knew something I didn't. But the point is, that should have been such a red line to the American public to go in and disrupt someone else's religious service. I mean, it directly interferes with the First Amendment protection of freedom of religion. And yet, that was going on public television, and that was the government policy, and it was the elite policy, and it was the left's policy. Isn't this simply another version of Stop the Church? It's a loaded question, but you can answer.
Well, no, I mean, you need to go back to Marx and Engels, who said we need to destroy the family and we need to destroy religion, and that means the Judeo-Christian heritage that we have. They wanted, of course, they wanted all the power to be in the hands of the state. Now, what are the two biggest obstacles to totalitarianism? It's always been the family and religion. If you can crush the family, you can crush religion. There's nothing left for people to identify with, and the state takes over. There's no other authority structure. Now, it was Gramsci, the Italian Marxist, who was smarter than Karl Marx. Marx thought you could rally the urban factory workers, the proletariat. They didn't care about that. Those are the hard acts who beat up the hippies back in the 1970s in New York City. And they're the ones who voted for Trump. No, what Gramsci understood is that if you want to transform a society, bring about socialism and communism, what you do is you use the cultural institutions, the media, the schools, particularly the universities, the churches, the entertainment industry, the disseminators of ideas, and you poison the public mind that way. That's how you get to them. So the idea that Larry Kramer and ACT UP in December of 1989 would crash into St. Patrick's Cathedral during a mass and lock themselves to the pews to spit the Eucharist on the floor. Mayor Koch, whom I loved, he was a Jewish guy, he was a great guy. He was horrified. He was in the church at the time. He referred to this as Nazi-like behavior. This was incredible what would happen. The New York Times could only give it a slap on the wrist about what happened. Yeah, the left is always seen, not just the Catholic Church. Let's face it, our ideas on sexuality came from our Jewish brothers and sisters, all right? So the left doesn't
well,
mind.
They certainly didn't come from the Greeks or the Babylonians or
no,
the
it certainly
Egyptians.
didn't. No, that's paganism. But Orthodox Jews to this day, evangelicals in particular, much more so than the mainline Protestants, Mormons, Muslims, they accept pretty much the same ideas that sex should be between a man and a woman in the institution of marriage, and we should basically exercise restraint, a kind of sexual ethics of reticence. Well, that, of course, is at war with the whole libertine idea of the sexual revolution of everything goes. So the idea is this: if you can chip away at the Catholic Church, if you can basically silence its moral voice, by pointing out, oh, see, you've got these priests, these wayward priests and whatnot, who are you to talk? You can basically try to intimidate the Catholic Church from pronouncing it on matters sexual. And then you can go after the Jews and the Muslims and the evangelicals and the Mormons and others. But let's first go after the big boy in the block, the biggest fish to fry. And I've been seeing this at the Catholic League now for almost 3 decades. It's absolutely amazing what the left is involved in. Yeah, none of this stuff just happens. And David Horace is right. Yeah, but besides the issue, there's something else. You ought to dig a little bit harder and you'll find out what's going on.
Okay, well, I think your book goes into that. You talk about 2 conspiracy theories, as they call them today. The first was, you said there was a Lavender Mafia in the church. I was shocked to see that explicitly stated in a chapter, by a Catholic leader. And you talked about how it was a whole network and people were protected and all sorts of incredible, scoops, really. And maybe you should talk a little bit about that first. What is the Lavender Mafia?
Well, the term actually comes from a very liberal Catholic priest whom I did not get along with. He like me, he's Irish Catholic, and he has a doctorate in sociology.
Wow.
We butted heads many times. He's dead, Andrew Greeley. He was the sex novelist. He had a particular disdain for me, but it was Greeley, the liberal, who was totally wrong on so many of his projections. I criticized it many times in the book, but I have to give him credit on this one. He talked about the Lavender Mafia, not Bill Donohue. I picked it up from him.
Huh.
So it was the guys on the left who was at least honest enough to talk about what's going on. And Pope Benedict in particular has written extensively about the corruption in the seminaries in the 1970s, 60s, 70s, again, and 80s. Most of the damage was done between 65 and 85, not all of it, most of it. And that's the time of the sexual revolution. What happened in some of the seminaries, not all of them, but too many of them, the word got out. This was a free-for-all. Come on in, join the Catholic Church. They welcome homosexuals. You can do what you want. You read the books by Kosnick and Bauer and Crooks about human sexuality. Don't make any judgments about people. And yeah, I mean, then they put into practice the ideas which were made in the 1960s. They came to fore behaviorally in the 1970s. And yeah, the gays covered for each other. They drove in the 1970s. I can't tell you how many straight men out of the priesthood. There were straight guys that were in there. They couldn't believe what they're working with and dealing with, and they just simply left the Catholic Church. And I even talk about how sick it was that one particular case, there was this one gay guy who was having sex with a Jesuit priest. Real shocker that the Jesuits came out so bad on this, because they're the most left of any prominent group in the Catholic Church. They have a horrendous record with this and with AIDS, quite frankly. And he's having sex, this lay guy, with a Jesuit priest. And instead of the Jesuit priest quitting and being an honest man and becoming a layman and go have sex with his boyfriend, the boyfriend decides to become a Jesuit so he can have sex with other Jesuits. That was going on back then. It's hard to believe, but look, I love the Catholic Church, but I am not going to sugarcoat anything. People have problems in their own family. We have to deal with it. It's best to be honest so you have to have a correct diagnosis. Somebody once said to me a few weeks ago, well, Bill, what if most of the problem was caused by gays? Why should that matter? I'll tell you why it should matter. If I have a problem with my ear or my foot, I go to an ear doctor and a foot doctor, and he gives me the wrong diagnosis. I may actually get worse. All right? We've had a problem in the Catholic Church, 65 to 85 mostly. If we don't have a correct diagnosis of what it is, we'll never get rid of this problem. It was never, ever pedophilia. Pedophilia, prepubescent boys, that's 3.5% of all the cases of molestation as recorded by John Jay College of Criminal Justice between 1950 and 2002. It's almost all homosexual driven. And one more final comment here. 149 priests out of tens of thousands of priests, actually hundreds of thousands, if you take a look between 1950 and 2002, are responsible for 26% of all the cases of molestation. In other words, a very small, tiny percent of bad guy priests accounted for about a quarter of all of the cases.
Well, that makes sense. That's typical sociology, whatever the Pareto rule, 80-20 or whatever it is. So
Right.
That's very interesting. let's talk about one more thing. The left, which I like to call communists, but they never say they're communists, or communist sympathizers within the Catholic Church. I just, to prepare for this, was sort of Googling, and I found an article, unbelievable, from America Magazine from 2019. Now, this is after a long history with the Catholic Church and the communists, by a guy named Dean Detloff. I don't know if you can see it here. It's called The Catholic Case for Communism. And there are a lot of leftists in the church, and no doubt they were supporting the left agenda. You, in your book, have 2 chapters about communist operations within the Catholic Church, and you refer to actual people who testified about this. What is the role of that in this particular crisis?
Well, first of all, that publication you mentioned, America, is the flagship publication of the Jesuits. All right, so I have to add that. All right, so we know what we're talking about here. I'm not saying that all Jesuits are bad guys. I know a lot of good ones, but unfortunately, their reputation when it comes to this area is very, very bad. It is definitely a home for an awful lot of left-wing Catholics. There's no question about that. Now, going back to the 1950s, an Italian Catholic, Bella Dodd, she testified for House subcommittees about the extent to which she had worked with other communists to put homosexual men into the priesthood, to recruit them to actually join, to infest the Catholic Church, and to help to destroy it from within, because they knew that the goal was, if you can crack the edifice of the Catholic Church, boy, it's wide open. Then the communists can go in and do pretty much whatever they want. And then you had Saul Alinsky. He was never a card-carrying member of the Communist Party, but he worked very closely with them. He was very happy with them. He worked very closely with the Chicago Catholics, who were very left, there, and they knew what they were doing. He was more than just a community organizer. These people had an agenda, and their agenda wasn't to make the Catholic Church stronger. It was to reform it in a way in which people like myself wouldn't even recognize it anymore. And it's pernicious what they've done. And now, you've even seen with WikiLeaks. Remember, just recently, that we came out, Anthony Podesta, another professed Catholic. He's there, the Center for American Progress, very close associate and campaign manager with Hillary Clinton. They came out with the WikiLeaks that they wanted like an Arab Spring, a Catholic Spring, they called it. They wanted to revolutionize the Catholic Church. And to that end, they set up dummy organizations, George Soros funded organizations such as Catholics United and Catholics Alliance and the Common Good. I fought with these people for years, to the point where they wouldn't debate me anymore. I knew they were frauds. I didn't know, in all honesty, until WikiLeaks came out, that positively evidence, because it came from the horse's mouth, they were intentionally set up by the left to act like termites from within the Catholic Church, posing as Catholic while promoting the most pernicious ideas. It's like that group, Catholics for Choice. All right, they're still in existence. They're funded by the Ford Foundation. If you're a practicing Catholic, you can't possibly be in favor of abortion, never mind champion it. Although we do have a president of the United States who has never found an abortion he could not justify, and they say he's very devout because he carries his rosary. I don't care about his rosary. I care about his policies. The man is a disgrace to Catholics.
Well, those are fighting words. I think he's also an Irish Catholic, so you wouldn't want to find him in a dark alley because he's always threatening to beat people up. But I guess you could handle yourself. I mean, this is what's so interesting to me. You have this huge church, which has very strict rules, but it seems within it, anything goes. I mean, even to this day. I mean, how do you deal with that? What's your prescription?
I have been in education for 20 years. I taught every grade from the second grade to newly minted PhDs from around the world in the Fulbright program at NYU. I know all the ideas about the Catholic Church being repressive. I've never seen an institution, which I love, which has more rules and is less willing to enforce them than the Catholic Church. It is astonishing to me to see what goes on. And we have the old idea of the nuns with the ruler and whatnot. Boy, they ought to bring that back tomorrow. But first, you have to get some really solid nuns. Well, there are some. We've got some of the most incredible problems with the dissenting nuns in the Catholic Church. But quite frankly, there's more free speech allowed in your local Irish pub in Washington, D.C., New York, or any place than there is on your local college campus. And indeed, there is more a free reign with impunity in the Catholic Church than you'll see on the college campuses. So the whole thing is upside down and inside out. I wish the Catholic Church was as stern in enforcing its rules as it's alleged to, because if they had been in the first place, we wouldn't have had the crisis.
Well, I think that's a perfect way to end. I think you've summed it up right there. I think that is the point of your book, which is actually written from a love of the Catholic Church. And one of the people who comes out is the New York Cardinal, who's a friend of yours, O'Connor, I think.
Yes.
He comes out looking good. So we should talk a little bit about somebody who comes out of this crisis looking good.
Cardinal O'Connor comes out well, as does Cardinal Dolan, the current Archbishop of New York. But O'Connor, I'd have to say personally, of all the priests I've ever met, I love him number one. If he's not in heaven, there is no heaven. And he found out about McCarrick in New Jersey. And he kept getting letters. At first he said, well, maybe it's not true. And then he kept getting more and more letters from different women about he's sleeping with these men intentionally. I have a chapter in the book called The Role of Evil, where I say most of these molesting priests were sick, but they weren't evil, because I don't think that word should be overused. But there are some, I identify a few, one of whom is McCarrick. When you are inviting men to your home down the Jersey Shore in Seagirt, and you have 4 beds, and you invite 5 men, all right, intentionally, and you expect them to sleep with you, you're raping them psychologically, spiritually, and physically. That's the hand of Satan. I think there's no other way to understand that. And when Cardinal O'Connor was convinced that there was something to these allegations, then he notified Rome. Now, O'Connor was up in his years, close to death. The Pope was dying himself, practically, John Paul II. And unfortunately, the people surrounding the Pope, the gatekeepers, didn't really listen to O'Connor. Had they listened to him, instead of going back to their friend McCarrick, who, what do you think he was going to say? So, he blew the whistle on this, and he cracked the whip here in New York, which is why you haven't had a big problem in New York like you did in Boston and Chicago and even smaller dioceses like Louisville and others. He was a great man, and he should be a model for others, other priests to this day. He certainly is in my mind.
Well, thank you very much. This was a most enlightening interview. I wish you luck with the book. I hope, have you gotten any reviews in like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or National Review or anything like that?
Yeah, you know, it's funny. Even the Catholic left has not said a word. If I say anything about anything, they're always criticizing me. They don't want the word of the book to get out there. That's okay. They don't own the media. I've got lots of channels. We're getting the book out. It's doing very well. But yeah, it would do even better if I guess they've made a calculated decision. If we attack Donohue on his book, then it'll generate more sales. So they're acting like as if it was never published. I wouldn't expect anything for them. They won't debate me. They're a bunch of cowards. And there's nothing worse than a Catholic coward. Unfortunately, we got a lot of them.
All right. Well, that said, you're no coward. You're probably the bravest man I know. And I salute you. And I also want to wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And I hope this next year is a better one for all of us. Because
I hope so too. And Happy Hanukkah to you as well as Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Well,
thank you. And I hope you'll keep fighting. And I hope we'll have more chances, because it's always a good interview. And I hope this sells a few books. As I said to Mr. McDonald, I was afraid if I did it for YouTube, they'd ban me, but I see you have a YouTube channel. So now that I know that, I will put it on Rumble and on YouTube and see if we can get a few more hits. So, okay.
I mean, I'm not shooting for the hip. Like I say, I've got well over 800 footnotes in the book. This is not an essay. I'm not against essays. I write lots of them. But this is a work of scholarship, and I want people to take a look at it. They can't disagree with the data. You can certainly disagree with my conclusions. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think that's the reason I kind of checkmated the Catholic left and the left in general, not just the Catholic left. They don't want the word to get out.
Well, you know, if the Catholic Church had followed your lead from the beginning, the crisis could have been avoided, I think. That's in your book. You were actually involved in the early days. I didn't realize that. So
that's exactly right. And one final word to Catholics: don't get discouraged. Every single Catholic priest who was errant, who was a molester, violated the Catholic Church's teachings. There's nothing wrong with the teachings. It's the abandonment of them that led to the crisis. And that's an important distinction. You're going to have rotten priests, like you have rotten members of the clergy in any religion, or presidents and whatnot. But you have to look at the strictures, the tenets. There's nothing wrong with the 10 Commandments. The fact that people violate them shouldn't suggest to us that we should get rid of them.
That's a good note to end on. And I'll just add, just because of current events, Epstein had a faculty position at Harvard University. And he's never been called to account. Nobody's saying shut down Harvard University because it's a nest of child molesters.
Right.
So it's just interesting. All right. Well, maybe your next book can be about that. Thank you. And bless you. And we'll see you next year. Stay healthy.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Okay. Bye-bye.